шановні колеги. Я хотів би кілька вітальних слів сказати від Національної спілки журналістів України, яку я маю честь очолювати. І, власне, сьогодні ми проводимо наш спільний ось такий захід у співпраці з Дарт-центром, який є ініціативою Колумбійської школи журналістики, і Дарт-центр, і Гевін Ріс, який є провідним експертом і, власне, ініціатором ось цієї серії 3 воркшопів поглибленого рівня для українських журналістів, то Дарт-центр є визнаною в світі, в журналістському світі організація, яка спеціалізується на допомозі журналістам і медіапрацівникам в роботі над складними темами, а також в увазі до ментального здоров'я журналістів. Тому ми з вами, на жаль, живемо в умовах такої вже виснажливої повномасштабної війни, яка триває вже майже 3 роки, і, звичайно, що це наш обов'язок, зокрема, і кожного українця, і українського журналіста, якби триматися і продовжувати нашу діяльність. Водночас, очевидно, що ми потребуємо певних порад і допомоги для того, щоб ми були внутрішньо стійкими, для того, щоб ми могли продовжувати нашу діяльність, не вигорати, і водночас для того, щоб ми могли працювати зі складними, важкими темами, бо це теж наш обов'язок. І тому ми відкриваємо сьогодні перший ось такий воркшоп. Загалом відбудеться 3 у нас отакі зустрічі, але це є унікальна нагода для нас, для українських журналістів, бути на воркшопах експертами, де виступають наші світі журналістів і медіаекспертів. Тому продовжуємо і навчатися, бути в такому певному ресурсі, підтримувати один одного. Це надзвичайно важливий захід. Також я хотів би особливо привітати колег, учасників сьогоднішньої зустрічі, які працюють у прифронтових медіа в умовах взагалі надзвичайних. Слова вам підтримки, гордості, захоплення. Ви великі молодці. І ми, як Спілка журналістів України, на всіх майданчиках підкреслюємо важливість, необхідність підтримки прифронтових медіа і журналістів з прифронтових територій. Буквально сьогодні це теж важливий такий психологічний імпульс підтримки. Вийшов, що британська газета Daily Mail дала репортаж, розворот про головного редактора з газети прифронтової, прикордонної з Харківщини, про Василя Мірошника, як він в умовах надзвичайно небезпечних розвозить тираж газети і ризикує власним життям щотижня. І він дійсно на сьогодні герой британської газети. Минулого тижня опублікували про одного з учасників нашого воркшопу Олексія Пасюги, найкраща провідна газета канадська The Global Mail, теж репортаж. Я думаю, що ці важливі матеріали, вони теж є складовою такої підтримки і тих слів, які хоче почути і кожен, хто працює при фронтових, і загалом, хто працює в українських медіа. Шановні колеги, дякую вам за велику активність до сьогоднішньої події. У нас зібрали вже понад 80 учасників. Це один з таких рекордів для такого спеціалізованого воркшопу, тому очікування великі і вдалого нам і навчання, і вдалої події. Ще раз хочу подякувати Гевіну, з яким ми вже тривалий час ведемо перемовини і якраз реалізовуємо важливі ініціативи для українських журналістів. Дякую.
Great. No, thanks. Thanks so much for those words. And it's a real pleasure for us to be here. I'm just going to put something up on the screen very quickly. So I'm just going to share this. If you can see that, it's just a kind of simple post-it slide, really. Hang on, gone forward. So I want to thank our sponsors. So this event is sponsored by UNESCO and also the government of Japan, which has supplied the funding. And so this is a webinar. It's a short 90-minute session, but the Dart-Centre has been working kind of steadily over the last 2 or 3 years, trying to do what we can with our limited resources from abroad to support Ukrainian journalists. And so we'll send you this link at the end of the session, but we do have a kind of small microsite in Ukrainian language that we're planning to expand, and that contains a lot of the kind of technical information as well that we'll be talking about here. So I'm just going to stop share and go back to kind of normal view, and we'll send that link to you later on. So as I said earlier, that one of the things about working in a war or working covering trauma is the way that it stretches us. It stretches our capacity to find the right words when we're talking to vulnerable people. How do we arrive in people's lives just after they've experienced loss or injury and shape a conversation that helps us to understand what happened, helps us to kind of pass on valuable information to the community without adding to the difficulties of the people that we're talking to. Now, I have 3 wonderful speakers who aren't Ukrainians. They come from very different contexts, very different worlds. And so it's kind of important to say now that when we're talking about these challenges, that we'll be talking about situations and contexts that are very different to Ukraine. And that's actually deliberate. We're doing that on purpose because sometimes it's really helpful when we're very close to a situation or very close to a circumstance is to hear ideas and information from journalists who are working in very different contexts. Sometimes that chance to think things through from a different angle can open up kind of new ways of thinking. The other thing that we've been doing in the last year is rolling out training for news editors and bringing Ukrainian news editors and trainers together with UNESCO's support and doing kind of more detailed workshops in which we discuss the issues for 2 days. And these have been very interesting because one of the themes about dealing with self-care and managing burnout that comes through strongly is that actually it's often through paying attention to the craft details, like how do we interview people, how do we frame stories, how do we maintain a focus on what's really important, that actually that's also very important for our own self-care. So if we feel that we're making mistakes, that we're asking people inappropriate questions, we're becoming overwhelmed by the detail and finding it hard to find the most important things to communicate, that also affects our emotional well-being. And so all of these things are connected, and I'm sure that will emerge in the conversations. But enough of me speaking. Let me introduce you to my colleagues very quickly. First of all, we have Ppatricія Євангеліста. If you can turn your camera on, Pat, I think, and wave at us, that would be helpful. Get lost in the swarm of people. Hi, there we go. So Ppatricія is a trauma journalist in the sense of somebody who specializes on covering the impact of trauma on her society in the Philippines. For many years, she's reported on the drugs war, and has very direct experience of working, of opposing dictatorship, of opposing autocracy, and trying to find words for people in challenging circumstances. She's also a very successful and fated novelist. Her book, Some People Need Killing, a memoir of murder in my country, which is an account of the killings during the Philippine drug war. It's been hailed as a journalistic masterpiece by the New Yorker and was the Times #1 non-fiction book of the year. And also very delighted to introduce Anджеліна Fusco, who I've known for many years. Anджеліna is a former BBC news editor from Northern Ireland, a place that has known terrible, long-lasting conflict. And one of the things that Anджеліna did was that she presided over news teams at the BBC as an editor and manager during a period in which the country was negotiating from conflict, active conflict, through to some kind of peace process and cessation of violence. And she can talk more about that, which might be interesting for people to understand. And lastly, I'm delighted to introduce John Wudrou Kokс, who's just turned his camera on. And John is the enterprise reporter at the Washington Post, and he's the author of Children Under Fire, An American Crisis. So one of the things that John has specialized in, something we might touch upon in this seminar, and we're going to talk about in the next seminar in more detail, are the challenges of giving voices to children in situations in which we're concerned about children, but maybe we don't give them the space they need to speak. And that's us as the kind of opening offering. So one thing I'd just like to kind of reiterate this idea is that we are going to be talking about different contexts and different places. So this is a bit like a trip into the supermarket. There'll be things that you hear that you'll want to take home with you that will be very useful and different to what you're used to. And there'll be other things that you know that, or perhaps that aren't relevant. So shop wisely and take good notes. We'll also share a recording of the session afterwards, so you can pick up on things and explore things in more detail. So let's start, if we may, with Anджеліna. Do you want to take us away?
Okay, thank you very much for the invitation to share some of my experiences and learning from covering the troubles or conflict in 40 years in Northern Ireland, and to be in this panel. Having had the opportunity a few years ago to be in Kyiv and Lviv to deliver Dart-center training, journalists covering this Russian invasion and the violence that you're reporting on are in my thoughts regularly. I hope you can hear me. If you can give me a thumbs up, my speed's okay. As I prepared for this discussion, I wondered, what I could share that would be useful. And I thought it might be useful to give you a very, very short history that will just set the context for the coverage. So I'm going to share some slides, and let me see if I can do this. Yay. Okay, so I am from Belfast in Northern Ireland, and just in case you don't know what that is, it's just off the western seaboard of Europe. And my experience of conflict, war, sectarian divisions, no one can actually decide what it is a million miles away from what you're living through and have lived through in the past 3 years. And as Gavin says, the experiences are not comparable. I know they're different, but I want to say what happened here is fairly unique. Our numbers of dead and injured are small compared to most conflicts, and especially what you have been involved in. But we have all witnessed pain and anguish, and that is the same for all journalists and all victims and survivors, no matter where it happens. So we're the little teddy bear off the coast of Britain, and our story really started around the 1600s when Britain invaded Ireland, really to keep itself safe from Europe. And like all colonial powers, after the invasion, there was plantation and subjugation of the Irish, etc. And that went on for centuries. We had a famine, we had rebellions, we had a division in the country in the 1920s, which left the little top northeast a separate place. It was called Northern Ireland as opposed to the whole of the island, and was separate. And unfortunately, had our division was more political and religious. So unfortunately, the minority, which was a Catholic population, were powerless and discriminated against. So that all kind of happened well before my time. But as I was coming into the world, and there were lots of protests for civil rights and social justice and employment, equity in employment and housing, etc. And so there were lots of, as I was 9, there were lots of all of these civil rights protests. Similar ones took place in America with people from the Black community, but they were harshly put down. And basically Catholics were to be not even seen, but definitely not heard. So there was lots of, as you understand, scaremongering, fear-mongering by local politicians who did not want their power to be taken away. And in 1969, it became a very violent society with communities attacking each other, burning streets out, killing one another. In this street on the left-hand side, my aunt and uncle lived in it, and they were destroyed. In 1971, the same day, the house on the right used to be my house. And we had to run away after being shot at with my family and left there. They didn't burn that down, and someone now lives in it today. But unlike Ukraine, I suppose, we had multiple agencies involved. We had extremist groups on the Catholic Republican side, and then on the Protestant Loyalist side, and then the British government's own security forces came in and got involved and carried out, for all intensive purposes, atrocities, murders that were unjustified. And only today in the courts, there's been another case against the British government and against soldiers. So this story may have finished a while back, and it will happen in Europe when the war is over. There will be a legacy of other violence and other hurt that will come to the fore. So we had British Army, state soldiers shooting unarmed civilians. We had IRA terrorists killing and trying to kill government ministers, ordinary people, soldiers. We had the other side, as they called, the loyalists, Protestant community, carrying out attacks, shootings, bombings, etc. The fathers of 3 of my friends were all killed by different forces. And my own cousin, Tony, was also killed. He was about to be a father and he was shot dead on the street. So my journalism career was about covering shootings, bombings, funerals regularly, because we covered every funeral that there was. And that was really difficult. And then in the midst of that, I joined the BBC. And one of the things that we learned in the BBC was, and shared with each other, was that you left your politics and your religion at the door. Now, I know that's more difficult where you are, because obviously you have a country that's invaded your country, but this is what happened in our area, because we were from all sides of the community. So we had to leave our politics at the door, and our mission was to be a journalist, to tell stories, to reflect accurately and as impartially as we could the stories that were going on. We were very careful about our language. We were as factual as we could. We tried not to use flowery and adjectives to, one killing was, this is a dreadful, the most heinous crime. But if you didn't use that about another crime, then the families could say, are they unequal? Also, we had times when our communities that we went back to live in were not happy with what we were reporting. They were suspicious of us. We were representing another side. People thought the BBC maybe was too British. Others thought we weren't British enough. So we had lots of pressures and threats. The government introduced a ban against some political parties who were connected to extremists. We had unlawful killings, and there was pressure not to question or report those. We've had security forces monitoring the phones of journalists, and some journalists were killed in the Troubles, others were injured, and other people were forced to leave Northern Ireland because they were threatened with death. So that went on from, I went into journalism in 1979 right through, I suppose, up to 1997, 98, when there was a negotiated settlement, and it was called the Good Friday Agreement. And this was really important. It had the Americans, the British, the Irish, all the extremists, most of the extremists involved. And we thought, right, that's great. I became the editor of this program called BBC Newsline. And we thought, well, you know, we'll still have to report on the politics and legacy of the Troubles, but actually we can now do other stories like housing and health and education. And I took over the editorship on the 1st of July, 1998. But for me, it was so good that the Troubles were over, my children would be safe, journalists would be safe, we wouldn't have to see or hear or smell that level of violence and death again. Unfortunately, on the 15th of August, we had our biggest loss of life when an extremist group, not aligned to the peace process, exploded this car, this red car, in a place called Omagh, a little town in the middle of Northern Ireland, while people were out doing their shopping. And that really shocked not just the community, but I think at heart it shocked the journalists. We went back into autopilot of covering the Troubles, covering violence, covering interviews with the injured and the dead and the victims, the families of the dead. But also, we didn't really want to do that anymore. We thought it was over. And so I think a lot of people really started to reflect on the mission and what were the things that we could maybe start to talk about, which we had never done before. And that continued for, you know, quite some time. In and around 2002, my colleague, who's on this guy in the blue shirt, got in touch with the Dart-Centrom, and he came back and shared the information with us. And we realized that the word journalism and trauma could be put together. We could learn how to interview people better. We could learn what trauma does to people when they're affected, when they've been through these terrible experiences, and also how we could look after ourselves. And one of his learnings and what he took away was he started to work on a book called Lost Lives, which was the story of men, women, and children who died in the Troubles. And it's out of print now. But as you can see, we have a very small number of people who've been killed. 3,500, 47,000 odds injured. I mean, that's really is incomparable to what you're suffering. But people's pain is the same. We have a legacy of traumatic events. So while you're still living through this war, when eventually it ends, there's going to be a legacy of people injured. The guy in the right-hand side in the Umbro t-shirt, he has no legs because he was shot in the legs and they had to cut them off. On the left is the father of a child who was killed in the Troubles. And I just thought this was interesting to share with you. Bullets travel through time as well as distance. And that will happen. And that can be explosions, it can be bullets. And this stays with people for all their lives. One survivor, 40 years on, talks about swimming in the soup of trauma, hurt, and pain. So it's really important, I think, that we remember with the victims to be respectful and to be upfront about what we do. We don't overpromise what we can do. We're really not there to make them feel better. We don't want to make them feel worse, but we don't want to make them feel better because we can't. We're going to move on to another story. And you might hear something that, you know, physically makes you winch a little bit because it's sore, it's painful for you to hear. We also have lots of inquiries that are going on about killings. We still have violence going on today, less so, and only in certain areas. So I suppose my craft learning is to recognize agency of those who are hurt and in pain or powerless while you're meeting deadlines, how to revisit and cover anniversaries, contributors. There are those who are going to be angry. There are those who might want to forgive. Do we have a hierarchy of victims and survivors? With your sources, try to establish some boundaries that give you time to walk away and, you know, think about things, that they're not contacting you 24 hours a day about their stories while you're trying to do other stories. And also, you're not alone. Journalists are facing similar craft challenges right across the globe. I suppose we can maybe talk about this later on, but just in terms of being an editor and leading the team, I had to notice when there were challenging stories. Only yesterday, I messaged a guy who was my reporter who's covering an inquiry into the Oma bombing. And I said, you know, are you okay? It's been very sad to listen to those stories, but I'm at home and you're in the court. And, you know, are you looking after yourself? And he was really pleased that I'd done that. Talking and sharing dilemmas in open meetings on a regular basis, making it okay to say, oh, I had a bad day yesterday. It was really difficult. And I know your bad days are maybe every day for a while, but at least taking the time at some stage to ask for some support, ask for understanding. And if you're an editor, give praise fairly regularly. I think I'll skip over the learning. But one of the things I do want to just share with you is one of my colleagues in the Dart-Centre came up with this and I loved it. And I printed it out and I stuck it on my fridge. And that means that if you're really stressed all of the time, and I can appreciate that you're probably up at 9 or 9.5, but if you can try to find ways to help yourself relax, then you can do your journalism better. If you're always stressed and then something else happens, it can mean you can be out of control and your journalism will not be as good as it could be. And I know that sounds maybe very superficial, but I have found that it really helps because I try, you know, to keep myself calm in the morning when I get up and have my coffee. I know I'm going to have a really difficult day, but even by doing simple things like breathing, looking at nature when I can, just helps to prepare myself for the really bad day ahead. And then finally, we were involved with an organization here, which came up with guidelines for victims and survivors, but also journalists in how to cover any victim and survivor. So there could be a conflict, or it could be migrants who've been attacked, or it could be sex workers or whistleblowers. But I've given a copy to Gavin, and they might be able to share again. Some things may be useful at this time, and some things may be useful in the years ahead. I hope that has given you some idea of my story and some of the learning. And I'm just going to leave you with our Nobel writer, Seamus Heaney. And I believe you will have the words and that you'll find a way.
Great, thanks very much, Angelina, for that context and that introduction to Northern Ireland. And it's interesting because obviously it's not the same, but there are similar kind of history and challenges. One of the things that we talked about is this kind of question about who gets to speak. And you mentioned it in your presentation, but I think it's a very kind of interesting one, because sometimes, we've talked about this before, but sometimes it's always the same person who acts as the spokesperson for the tragedy. And I wondered if you could share a few thoughts on what happens if we're always talking to the same contributors and not thinking a bit more broadly.
Yeah, this came later in the Troubles. When it came to the Omagh bombing, a lot of the families spoke to us, and they were so eloquent and fluent. They're now this week, in the last 2 weeks, been giving their testimonies again to an inquiry. But there were also victims and survivors who were very angry with the media because we didn't let them tell their story. And sometimes that was because they said no the first time. So we would go to an atrocity with 8 or 10 people. We would knock on all the doors. Sometimes we would go through ministers or family members. So not like going right up to the door and banging it. But though some of those people were actually in hospital and were really badly injured. So by the time they came, and they were very angry because they had pain for the rest of their lives. But we had moved on to other stories and other atrocities. So they felt left out, and they felt they were voiceless. So I remember working with Seamus on the lost lives and saying, you know, if we can go back, if we can give people an opportunity to speak for the first time, we'll do that. And we kind of put that out with our journalists. You know, if you know anybody, sometimes you
I think the connection's gone down a bit. Okay, so I'm sure Angelina will come back on when the connection has reasserted itself. And so what I encourage you to do, if you have, we're going to go to the Patricia next, the next panelist. But what I'd encourage you to do is to write, if you have questions, because we want to hear your specific questions. If you write those in the chat, then we'll collect them and then we'll fold them in the second half of this conversation. So let me turn to Patricia, where are you? There you are. Take us to the Philippines.
Hello, my name is Patricía Євангеліста. You can call me Pat. I've been a journalist for 15 years, but for almost the last decade, the last 8 years, I've been covering the drug war declared by President Rodrigo Duterte in the Philippines. He is no longer president, but we're living with the after effects of it. So in 2016, a mayor from south of the Philippines wanted to run for president. His name was Rodrigo Duterte. And he said that the fundamental problem of the Philippines, the reason for all our poverty, all our pain, was because of the scourge of illegal drugs. And he promised to destroy it. He said that drug addicts were heartless and mindless, willing to murder their fathers and rape their sisters, and so bestial and bizarre that they would rape a goat if a goat were all they could find to rape. And he said the enemy was legion. Millions of people were responsible for our troubles. And he said he would kill them all. He said the fish would feed fat with the corpses of criminals. He said morticians would grow rich with a deluge of dead. And he said If your neighbor's child is an addict, kill them yourselves. It will be a kindness to their parents. Rodrigo Duterte won the election, and thousands died. Some were large-scale drug lords, but most were impoverished men, marijuana users, glue sniffers, small-time dealers. They were killed by cops, they were killed by vigilantes, and some of them were children. But the president said they were collateral damage. Now, there are no true numbers from the drug war because the numbers keep changing whenever there's a question of accountability. The minimum is 6,500, all killed by the police. It can go as high as 27,000 or 30,000, depending on how you look at the numbers. Now, I'm a narrative investigative journalist. For the first 3 years of the drug war, I worked for a small independent news agency named Rappler. For the 4 years after that, I was under contract with Random House. But for all of those times, I worked with a night shift, or that's what we called ourselves. We were a group of reporters, photographers, filmmakers from different news agencies from all over the country. And our job was to go from crime scene to crime scene, because at the height of the drug war, there were 9 dead in one night, 13, 27. And while it was an honor to work with the best and bravest of Philippine journalism, there were just too many crime scenes, and there weren't enough of us. So I learned the methodology on how to operate, and I'm sure many of you do when you're investigating, when you're covering much of the same thing again and again. I would ask the same questions every night. Was it a drive-by? Was it a salvaging? Was it a buy-bust? Was the killer a cop or a vigilante? Were the hands bound? Was the head wrapped in packing tape? Was there a gun on the ground? Was there a sign beside the body? So the steps were clear, and they were steps I applied long before I covered the drug war. But the one thing I learned that I never had to learn before the drug war was how to stand still and to listen for the screaming, because that's how I would know where the families were. So I would walk up to them, speak softly, apologize, condole, ask very simple questions, very uncomplicated. What was his name? Where was he born? When did you see him last? How did you know he was gone? I'm a narrative journalist, so it means imagery is important to me. So I would have a test for it right before I got into the car, after a crime scene, after an interview. If I could close my eyes and see the highway or the alleyway or the living room in 360 degrees, if I knew the color of the shoe, the tenor of the scream, the fact that the dead man was wearing red and white bikini briefs before he went home, that's when I knew I could go home, because I would take the story home with me. I can't write about what I can't see, and I can't see what I can't imagine myself. So just to give you context on what we were covering, I'll just tell you one story, a short one, I promise. I was standing at the high point of a bridge at 2 a.m. when I heard the woman scream. And it came from the bottom of the bridge. It was a high voice, loud but shrill. And then I saw her running up the bridge until she dropped to the ground beside me, right outside the yellow crime scene tape. And she said the dead man was her husband, and she said she knew him by his feet. The man on the ground was a large man with bare feet. His head had been wrapped in packing tape. His hands were bound. And when she said she knew him, she kept begging to touch him, but the cops wouldn't let her. What they did was they took out a small pair of scissors and tried to cut off the packing tape mask around his face, but the scissors broke. So they took a cutter and cut from the edge of one ear down to the chin, down to the edge of the other, and then lifted it off like a hockey mask. The face underneath was slack and damp. And there was a line across his neck. He had been stabbed 19 times with an ice pick, and he died of asphyxiation. He was garroted. And the woman, Ivy, I spoke to her very quickly at the crime scene. All I got was her name. I didn't want to ask anymore. I went to the funeral and I went to her son's birthday. I visited her many times across years. Many things happened to her after her husband died. She lost her job. She tried to cut open her wrist twice. She occasionally wraps her head in packing tape because she wants to know how it feels. And she blames herself for her husband's death because maybe if she had run up the bridge faster, maybe if she had pumped his chest sooner, maybe he would have lived. And the last time I was there, just before I was going to publish the book, so I would walk in, I'd have a bucket of chicken for her son, and then she would put an ashtray on the placemat, and I would push my cigarettes across. We would smoke. I would say we're on the record. And I said, so the book, we're coming out with a book. And I said, are you still okay with me telling your story? And she said, yes. Tell them our love story. So that's the reason I tell you the story now. I try to tell the story as often as I can because it matters to her. And what I'm going to talk about now is just two practical things. The first is consent, and the second is the interview. With us, because most of the interviews are trauma victims, people who have just discovered their families are dead, we do not immediately ask for the interview. Personally, I do not. We ask for the name. We ask where they come from. We check likely where the funeral parlor is, and then we look for them in the aftermath. My first rule of thumb is never to ask them how they feel. What we usually do is we explain our intent. I am a journalist. I am likely going to publish this story. And then if they refuse, we walk away. We leave a phone number, and this is what happens in the Philippines, so it might necessarily not be applicable to you guys. But we leave a phone number. If they are screaming, if they are angry, we do not try to convince them. We just walk away and say, we're so sorry. We accept the refusal, and we make no promises, because where I come from, the journalist is usually the first person they speak to. So they tend to cast us in whatever role they need at the moment. Psychiatrist, savior, anything that they need right now. So we make it very clear that all we can do, all we can promise is tell a story, that we will not achieve justice, that the world will not change, that all we're doing is telling the story as best as we can. We give them agency over time and place. How do you want to be interviewed? Where do you want to be recorded? Do you want to do it now? Do you want to do it later? If they're uncomfortable now, I'll come back to you. But for me, the most important thing is to come back, because I am not under the same danger they are. In the worst cases, we give them cell phones so that they can contact us directly with prepaid minutes. We tell them where to run if they have to run. Because when people die in small communities, sometimes brothers are killed one after the other by association. So I go back, I ask, are you still willing to tell this story? Once I came back to a mother whose son was killed by a cop. She had named the cop, and I came back and she was crying. She said she was grateful that someone was going to tell her son's story. And I said, are you sure? Because it might be dangerous. And she said, no, I'm so grateful. We published. And 2 hours after publication, and she called me and she said her only son, the only son left, was going to die, and it was my fault. And my editors wouldn't let me go back because I was already at risk. Everyone knew my face. I said I would send a priest. I said I would give them a location, but they wanted me. And I couldn't go. And for hours, we tried to negotiate until they stopped replying. I've lost contact since then. I know people that they know. I know they're safe. I know they're alive. But even now, I think I should have tried harder to stop them. Maybe I should have explained better. So yeah, I think the most important thing with consent is to keep coming back. the consent in the aftermath of a crime scene is very different from the consent 1 month later, 2 months later, 4 years later. Because I wrote a book, it meant my consents had to be renegotiated 4 years later. The second thing I'll talk about is the interview. Because I'm a narrative journalist, because all I have is a pen, I try to report for the imagination, because there's no music behind it. There's no images, there's no video. All I have is what people see when they read my words. So I try to have them see what I'm seeing. So it means I have to report heavily on sensory detail. So my questions are geared towards that. They are bound together by a scene I'm building in my head. But what I want to emphasize here is that for trauma victims, for people surviving trauma, not victims, we put facts first over feelings. We don't ask how they felt after they find their son dead, because obviously they feel terrible. We ask what the color of the shirt was, what they had for breakfast, where were they when they heard the scream. Of course, we want to know how they felt. So what I ask is, what was going through your head at that moment? That is still factual. And then, because we're looking at two people, we're looking at the survivor and we're looking at the victim, my goal always is to make the corpse a person again. So I go through hours of interview. I ask where he was born, but I also ask what he liked as a child, what he fell in love with, the first girlfriend, his favorite t-shirt. Most of these things may have nothing to do with that interview, but I will have the image of the person in my head. And the benefit is that you're asking factual things. You're not re-traumatizing. You can have a 6-hour interview asking about the crime scene without asking how they felt, and they'll tell you anyway. So to summarize, when we ask facts and feelings over feelings, we look at sensory detail. We ask for a definition of terms. When they say particular words, we ask them to define. When you say motherfucker in Filipino, do you mean motherfucker or son of a bitch or damn? We let them define their own terms instead of taking the definition away from them. I would recommend for people who have the time, because not a lot of people do, to let the interview go wherever they want to go. If it takes 3 hours, if it takes 5 hours, because more often than not, they're talking to journalists not to get the story out. They're talking to journalists to tell the story, period. They just want to talk. And if that's one thing we can offer, then that's enough. I think the last thing I want to say is that I'm talking about process because I am the last person to advise anyone on how to be mentally healthy while covering events like wars. I was not. I was on the field night after night. I was smoking 4 packs a day. I was obsessive and paranoid. When a phone rang, I thought it would be a phone call of someone who would tell me that my source was dead because of something I did. I was terrified at credit card bills because I thought someone was tracking me. I was afraid of a ringing doorbell. I was afraid of everything. I did the job because that's what you do. That's the mission. But when you do work that we do, when you obsess, when you bulletproof, when you are terrified that you'll kill someone because you said something you weren't supposed to say, what I learned from the Dart-Center and what I learned through the war is that the most important thing is to have a tribe. A group of people who understand what you're doing, who will not flinch when you say you saw 3 dead bodies tonight, who will be on the field with you, who will light your cigarette when you're standing over a dead body as they're taking pictures, and then the next day they'll do the same thing with you again. It matters. It really does. That's it.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. So Patricia, just
Yeah.
saying thank you for sharing. That was really helpful, I think, context. And there's also this issue about what it takes to look after yourself. And maybe because we're running short of time and I want to make sure that we have time for John and questions at the end. But there's one kind of thing that we talked about earlier that I think is helpful to pick up on, which is that for you, the telling the truth was very important. And you've talked a little bit about fidelity to the truth as a part of your survival mechanism or something. And I wondered if you could quickly tell us what you mean by that.
I think it was the answer to a question someone asked at some point. How can you keep doing what you do when there's no end in sight? When you are certain that you are not going to get justice for anyone, that maybe you're just barking up a wall. And my answer to that would be that I have very negotiated expectations. I do not believe that what I write will change the world or will stop one person being killed. I like to think I do what I do to keep a record. That it is important a story is told even if it does nothing. Because our job is to honor the people who tell those stories, to do it as honestly as possible, to do it as harshly as possible when necessary, and then do it again the next day. So it breaks journalists when terrible things happen every day and it feels like you can't do anything. I think I learned it early on to limit my expectations.
Good. Thank you for that. So let's hear from John, who's our third speaker. And it's a different context again. We're now heading to the United States. And John is both a longer format journalist and writer. He's written books, but it's also very much a working reporter who's out there in the field covering things on a daily basis if needed. So John, take us to your world and offer us some tips.
Sure. Thanks, Gavin. First, I want to just say that I'm really honored to be here, to be speaking to all of you, and I have such admiration for the courage that you all show every day to just keep at it and keep doing this work. It is critical, and those of us in other places are still reading, and we have not forgotten about you. So it's really a great honor to get to speak with you. A little bit of background. So in the United States, the leading cause of death for children and teenagers is gun violence. Much of that is through suicide. A lot of it is through community violence. A small portion of that is through school shootings, which is probably the form of gun violence in the U.S. that gets the most attention. But, the United States has more guns than it has people. We have in excess of 400 million guns. I have written about the impact of gun violence on children in the U.S. Since 2017, so for about 8 years. So I'm going to be just go through a few small things that I hope will be helpful. I'm going to see if I can share my screen. Give me 1 second. Okay, 1 second. Did that work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, I can see something.
So, I think there's so much about the work that you're all doing that I will never understand, that I can't understand. I think maybe the one element that I could relate to is making people care about an issue that feels so chronic, much in the same way that the previous two speakers talked about, is how do you keep people caring about something that feels intractable, that feels like maybe there is no solution. And here in the U.S., making people care about gun violence is a really difficult thing. Even though it is the leading cause of death for kids and teens, it has still become a real challenge to get people to engage with these really difficult stories. So there's a term in at least U.S. journalism that it's called going narrow and going deep. And it really, much of what Pat talked about actually gets at this idea, is that if you're trying to capture a big idea, something as large as a war, something as large as gun violence that is taking the lives of hundreds, thousands of children, how do you make people care? So statistics are useful, but they're also easy to ignore. So the idea is that you find one subject, somebody whose experience illuminates the larger story that you're trying to tell. And then you go deep. You surface details that make that person three-dimensional, that make them memorable. And you know, as I was nodding along, as Pat was talking about, the little fine details about the shirt they were wearing, what it smelled like, what it sounded like, who this person was, right? Spending hours to understand who this person was so that your reader on the other end can relate, can feel connected. It makes that person come alive, and it makes you as a reader care. If we think about works of fiction on television or books that we really care about, it's when we connect with a character. It's when we connect with another human being, and that's our duty, is to draw a reader in through humanizing our subjects. And then what I like to do is use data and statistics to give those personal stories weight, to elevate them. So I'm going to use one example. This is a little girl named Caitlin Gonzalez, and in 2022, in the state of Texas, there was a man who went into an elementary school, and he went in with an AR-15 and an assault rifle, and he killed 19 children and 2 teachers. They were all 4th graders. And this little girl, Caitlin, she was in a 4th grade classroom across the hallway from all the children who were being murdered. The girl in the background there is named Jackie, and she was Caitlin's best friend. And Caitlin could hear her screams. You could hear her screams from across the hallway. She recognized Jackie's screams. And so I spent the summer after this shooting in Texas, in this small town in Texas, following Caitlin, following her classmates, just embedding in their lives to understand, observing how their lives had changed. There's a form of journalism that I try to practice as often as possible that we call immersion. And it's where you're not just doing an interview with somebody, that you're actually immersing in their lives, that you're spending their days with them, their evenings with them. You're spending just hours and hours in their lives so that you can show your readers what it is that they're experiencing rather than just telling them. Interviews are incredibly useful and essential, but as much as you can actually get into people's lives and see for yourself how they are being impacted by the trauma, that's really useful. So when I talk about elevating a personal story with statistics, we created a database of school shootings going back to 1999. And Caitlin, to put her in sort of perspective for readers, she is one of nearly 400,000 students in the US who has experienced a school shooting in that period. So in the last 26 years, that's what she represents. She is one of 400,000 children who have gone through some version of what she went through. So much as like what Pat discussed, this idea of finding fine details, small details that are memorable, that make people understand who this person is. You know, I very much am a believer in never asking somebody how they feel. You know, and a way to understand how they feel is to just exist in their space. So this is just a little excerpt from a portion of the story. One of the most memorable moments that I had with Caitlin after she visited the school that she was going to be going to in 5th grade. She asked her mom if they could go to the cemetery where all of her friends were buried. She frequently went to the cemetery. It was, for her, it was cathartic. And again, you know, this is a 10-year-old girl. And this is just a little part of this. She basically gave me a tour of all of the grave sites of all of her friends. And she went around tidying the graves. And so just these little details that stuck out to me. You know, one of the girls who was killed, Caitlin told me that she'd given that little girl a chocolate donut a few hours before she died. She told me that as she was showing me her grave. On another grave were sunflowers. On one grave, there was a sign that said, quote, "Think happy." And it had fallen over, and Caitlin picked it up and put it right side up. One of the girls that she had gone trick-or-treating with just a few months earlier, and Caitlin had dressed as a singer, a famous singer, and her friend had dressed as a vampire. Caitlin described painting a little drop of fake blood on her friend's, the corner of her lip. So this is just meant to illustrate this idea that it's the fine detail, right? It's the fine detail that makes people come alive, that makes them memorable. And that's what sticks with readers. That's really how you can make a story last in a reader's mind. I know a lot of you, this is one thing I wanted to quickly address, is a lot of you are not on the ground, maybe, with some of the people that you're featuring. You're having to do your work over the phone or through Zoom, and that can be really challenging. It's a thing that I've dealt with at different times in my career, especially if you're on deadline, if you don't have the time to get to the person. Sometimes you just have to do the work over the phone. So a few tips that I have found useful in my own work when you have to do work on deadline over the phone is really to, again, it's asking for details that make the subject come alive. So things that we hear all the time as journalists in the US is, oh, this was such a great person. Everyone loved this person. There's a cliche in the US called, and this may be true elsewhere, is that, oh, he would give you the shirt off his back. It's this sort of cliche. It just means this person was very generous. Those are all meaningless to me as a journalist. I want specifics. You know, what were their hobbies? What were their quirks? What were their aspirations? I want to really understand who it is that they were, so that I can make that person three-dimensional, fully formed on the page. And you can ask for those things even if you're on the phone. I like to think, I try to make myself think cinematically, even when I am recreating something that already happened. So sometimes you can think about your sources as reporters. Is describe the scene. What did it smell like? What did it look like? What did the walls look like? Give me every detail. What happened in the first minute, the second minute, the third minute? You're asking them to think, if there was a camera in the room, how would you describe this? Because that's what you want the reader to feel, as if they are in the room as you're describing the scene. And that requires using all the senses. The question I ask most often, it really is, what happened next, right? I try to start people at the very beginning of, if I want to talk about a traumatic event, something like a school shooting, I will start at the very beginning of the day. What was the first thing you remember from that day? Because I'm just trying to condition their brain to say, this is the first thing I did, the second thing I did. I want them to understand what it is that I'm looking for. And when they give me a detail that I really like, I'll stop them and say, that's what I'm looking for. Give me more of that. That's exactly what I'm looking for. Because often people don't really understand what it is that we do. I found that a critical thing to do when you're reconstructing, when you're recreating, when you're reporting by phone, is to ask for text messages, direct messages, emails, anything that they have written in times past that will allow you to take the reader back to that moment. So I'm just going to give one example. This young woman on the screen, she is from Michigan, the state of Michigan, and she experienced a school shooting in high school. She was at a school where a teenager brought a gun and killed four of her teenage classmates. And then she went to college, and in her freshman year of college, she experienced another school shooting. There was a man who came onto campus and shot a number of people at her school, Michigan State. I was writing this story in just a few hours. She was hard to get in touch with. So I didn't have long. I couldn't fly to Michigan, which is several hours from where I live. I couldn't get there to interview in person. So one of the things I asked for was if she had been sending any text messages to her family or to her friends while this event was happening. She was hiding in her college dorm room, the room where she was living in a building on campus. And as it happened, she was hiding under her desk, not sure if the man with the gun was in her building or not. And she was frantically texting her father. So I was able to get screenshots of these text messages that she was exchanging with her dad, so that I could make readers understand much more viscerally, much more tangibly, what she was feeling and thinking and doing in the moment. So I'm just going to read these quickly. Is her father says, "I'm sorry, babe. Let's hope it is nothing." Emma, this girl, says back, "We're still in lockdown. The man is inside of the student union. I'm so scared." He says, "I know, I love you. He isn't going in the dorms. They have locked the buildings." She says, "Why haven't they caught him yet? He's so close, Dad." So these real-time text messages allowed me to take readers inside that specific moment in a way that if I said, "What do you remember? What was she saying?" it would never have been as powerful as the actual messages. So I always ask people, have you texted anybody? Are there any direct messages that you would feel comfortable sharing with me? So, because I know we're short on time, I just want to offer 2 bits of encouragement that these are things that I sort of tell myself as I'm doing this work, is that, you know, these stories that we do live on. They live beyond us. They live beyond the people that we're writing about. That is the power of what we get to do as journalists, is we are a keeper of record. And these events, they come and they go, but our stories can live on. And that for me is really meaningful, that I'm doing something, that I'm creating a record of a moment in time or about someone's life or their loss that can live beyond me and beyond them. And then, you know, another thing, you know, I'm writing about an issue that feels so intractable in the US. It is an issue that people are, they're incredibly discouraged about, that we cannot stop the killings of children in their classrooms, in their homes. And the way that I often think about it is that, you know, making one person care, changing one mind is still worth it. If that's all it is, or if it's even short of that, if I am just creating a record, that's still worth it. And I can tell you that you all are doing work that is changing minds and that is making people care. And that, in my view, is worth it, even if it's as simple as that. So thanks so much.
Great. Thanks, John. It's really helpful. I have one question though, so I want to pick up on one thing, which is the details incredibly important in order to get a sense of the real people. So it's really important, isn't it, that we don't just reduce people into the worst things that happen to them.
Right.
And that's partly because of storytelling, but that's also because of our need to respect the people that we're talking to. So it's a very kind of important part of that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And also the other thing I think a little bit about is this whole thing about funerals. You've got a kind of funeral, and when we go to a funeral, the funeral isn't just about the fact that somebody's died, the worst things that happened to them. It's a celebration of their value as a person. And that's getting us away from this kind of traveling into that, being sucked into the really difficult aversive detail. So that's one framing. But then there's the other question is that sometimes when we want details, or we're asking for details, maybe there's a danger of putting people so far back into their experiences that they have difficulty talking about those things. So I wondered what your guidelines would be to people in order to kind of make those questions feel safe. And what do you do if you're concerned about somebody? Maybe somebody's going to a place where they're not doing so well in answering a question. How would you do it?
That's a great question. I mean, I also interview a lot of children. You know, I interview children as young as 6 years old about really horrific events. And whether it's a child or an adult, you know, I start off by telling them that they don't have to answer any questions they don't want to. With children especially, I tell them that I am not an authority figure, that maybe every adult in their life is an authority figure. I am not. That they can say no to me, that they can ignore me, that they can say, I want to talk about this later. I don't want to talk about this ever. I also, you know, especially with children, I ask them where they're most comfortable talking to me. You know, often it is in their room. They want to show me their toys. I ask their parents to be nearby so that they can interject in case they think that their child's really struggling. I believe a great deal in agency. You know, I think that we can, as journalists, ascribe maybe rules, or we can maybe suspect that someone is struggling in a way that they're not, or maybe doesn't want to talk about something that they don't. I'll just give one really quick example. On the first night that I met Caitlin Gonzalez there in Texas, the idea was really just to make her comfortable, was for her to get comfortable with me, for her parents to get to know me. I didn't intend to ask any questions. She, within 30 minutes of having met her, she insisted on telling me the story of the shooting in great detail. And I paused her at one point and said, you know, Caitlin, we don't have to do this now. If you want to wait, we can talk about it later, but it's up to you. And she said, no, I want to tell you about it now. So, you know, we talked for 3 hours the first night that I met her. That was not ever what my intention was, but it's what she wanted. So for me, I like to let people steer the conversation. It's not my job to tell her it's too soon for you to talk about this. It's my job to empower her to direct the conversation however she wants it to go. And, you know, as Pat mentioned, I often find it's a dangerous thing, right? You can become someone's therapist. You can become something that they really depend on over time. You have to remind them through the course of reporting that I'm a journalist. I won't be here forever. That I'm going to have to tell another story eventually. But I often find, more often than not, it is extremely rare that people are not desperate to share with me what it is that they've experienced. And that's true for somebody who is 5 years old or 75 years old. They are eager to share. I will say this is actually a lesson that I learned from the Darт-Center. So we take people into really dark places, and it is our duty to bring them out of those dark places. So in interviews, we will ask them about the worst day, the worst moment of their lives, and we can't leave them there. So at the end of a conversation, at the end of an interview, I always will have questions in the back of my notebook that I know will bring their mood, their state of mind to a different place. And I often know, because I'm in the trauma with them, I'm in the horror with them, that I might, on the fly, I might not be able to surface that question in my own mind. So I actually will write those things down before the interview, just in case I'm feeling so overwhelmed that I can't sort of reach that place. I will have those 2 or 3 questions ready to go, so that at the end of the conversation, I can bring them back out of that place that I have taken them to. And that's a thing that I learned at a Dart session years ago, and I've held on to ever since.
Great. Thanks, John. That's really helpful. I mean, I'm just going to add something from my experiences of working with the Reckoning Project, the Public Interest Journalism Lab, and we've been doing training with them on interviewing survivors of torture, very kind of difficult things. And one of the things that kind of came up a lot in our conversations was the importance of not doing anything in your questioning style that is the same kind of questioning style the torturer might use. So be very careful with like why questions. So often policemen and intelligence people ask you like, why were you there? This kind of why question, and that can increase people's senses of kind of guilt, that maybe I did something wrong, maybe I shouldn't have been there. And also being careful about exactly that you said, which is a really kind of important point, is this idea of being the person who demands answers. And so it's really important that we don't come across like we're kind of demanding answers. And I think that's a kind of big thing in there. So I'm wondering if people have got more questions that you want to put into the chat, things that kind of come up. While we're waiting for people to put questions in, another thing that's interesting about the experience I've had working with Ukrainian journalists, and what your colleagues have told me sometimes, is that it can be quite hard sometimes to find that positive thing. Like, what are we going to talk about that closes down and wraps the interview up? And sometimes very simple things like, what's your plan for the rest of the day? What are you thinking about eating tonight? Are you going to take you're going to go and see a friend? All of these things that we can do are quite simple techniques to help people separate themselves a little bit from the stories that they've just told. So let's look at some of the questions that have come through. One thing is the interesting question somebody has asked is, are there examples of texts or I think formats for writing that can be used when we're writing obituaries? Or so the question, I think I might have misunderstood the question because it's being translated into English, is how do we, if we have to write an obituary, what kinds of things do we want to think about in order not to avoid kind of falling into cliche? And I think we talked about some of that already in the question about looking for details, but I wondered if maybe Anджеліна, you had a long experience of reporting on funerals and then doing effectively death notices in the media. What have you found helpful?
Yeah, in Ireland we have a practice called a wake, where people stay with the body in the house for a day or two before they're buried. And at that, it is an opportunity to listen to the stories about people that families talk about. And so when it comes to funerals, we tend not to interview people on the day of the funeral. We don't interview family. We'll have done the interview beforehand or when the funeral is over, because they have to say goodbye to their loved one respectfully and peacefully. We covered every single funeral that there was in Northern Ireland. So we would be discreet in where we placed ourselves. Sometimes the minister would say we could hook up to the sound monitor, but we didn't actually go into the church. We stayed outside. And I think, like John and Patricia, finding those personal details that were appropriate. I hate as well, John, that, they were full of life, and you're thinking, yes, but they're now not alive anymore. It's just, so what football team did they like? Did one of their local teams send a wreath? How has one thing that we often do is kind of as if they're very singular and they're isolated. So what has the family, a question can be, what has the community done? Have the community been supportive? Have your friends come along? Did people supply soup and stews and goulashes to help people through the difficult time? Especially in multiple murders or killings, how people have bonded together, helped each other. And I think those, though, trying not to give inappropriate personal details, but things that, again, as John and Patricia said, that might just connect you to a person thinking about, did they really like singing? They were in the choir. So asking about some of the actual process of arranging the funeral. Maybe the minister, married the person. And so you can get little bits of information about that without having to tread heavily on their loved ones at such a sensitive time.
Yeah. So the other question that one question has just come up talking about funerals which is maybe a Ukrainian thing. So it's important to understand that there are different cultural considerations in different places. But somebody has asked, what kinds of photos do we want to encourage or think about using to illustrate a story? And one of the added points to that question is about, do we publish a photo from the funeral?
Yeah, we would have published funeral, and I have to tell the story against myself. I once used video of a close-up of a little boy crying at his father's coffin, which I later really regretted because I felt we intruded on his on that moment of grief. But we would still use video from a funeral, but from further back. From the grounds of the church or the grounds of, we wouldn't really go to the cemetery, except if it was a very big political funeral. We would tend to go to the church and just make sure the funeral goes off peacefully, because there were attacks at funerals here. So we would take, but I would now encourage, sometimes a funeral of a beautiful wreath with a message on it, or the numbers of people attending, but not intrusively now on the faces of those who are grieving. I think that's more inappropriate now.
Great, thanks. And John, I thought you had a thought, I think, flickered when you heard that. I saw your face move.
I'm just agreeing. I was disagreeing with so much of that. I think the photo question is always so difficult, right? Because that is a way, we are limited in the words that we can write. We've dealt with that exact scenario, right? Like a child at his father's casket, right? I remember that one of the very first stories I wrote about on this issue of gun violence, I sat next to a little boy, a second grader. He was 8 years old, at his father's funeral. And he decided in the middle of his father's funeral, without prompting, to go up and take the microphone and talk about his dad. And it's one of those moments that, you know, I'll never forget. And we had we had a photographer there, because of course the family had agreed to let us be there and to tell that story. And you know, there are so many tricky decisions that you have to make. And I think too, I've thought about this many times, is, you know, we are tellers of truth, right? That is our duty, right? We are tellers of truth, but we also make choices. And those choices have consequences for the people we're writing about. And we have to weigh every single choice that we make. Even if it's true, we can't always just rely on, well, it was true, I was justified in using it. You know, we have a responsibility, especially when we're telling stories this sensitive. And, you know, sometimes that leads us to remove details from stories that we really wish we could have included. And I almost never have I regretted removing that detail that my gut or that my editor said, you know, maybe this is too far. Maybe this could cause harm.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have choice, we have agency, because I think a lot of the time we can feel like we have to do things in certain ways, but there are modifications that we can make. And one last thing on the funerals, and then I want to bring in Pat, is when it comes to pictures, I think also sometimes we forget that we can actually ask the family. You know, there are times that we can ask the family, what picture would you like us to use for this story? I mean, it's not always possible, and it's not always the right decision, but sometimes we have that flexibility, and we might not think about it because we're under deadline or time pressure, but that can make a lot of difference, particularly if people like the photograph. You know, this is a photograph that was my dad, and it's a favorite photograph, rather than something that we maybe we took off the internet that they don't particularly like as an image thing. So Patricia, I'm going to ask you what your thoughts are on when to stop and when to exclude certain details.
The troubling part is sometimes the answer is a word count. Very often there's nothing you can do about it. But for me, I go with John here. It's do no harm. But it's also the good thing about being a local reporter, reporting from where you come from, is you know what matters to people. That if in some place it will matter that he was a good son, in another place it will matter that he was a good husband. So there are many stories every which way. So for me, and as John said, we make choices. A lot of those choices are also personal for me. When I heard him say that he carried his father's body from the bottom of the ravine, it's not really that relevant to the story, but it mattered to me. I saw the image in my head and I thought, what a terrible thing to have to do that. So that's what I'll fixate on, because that is the scene that is built in my head. And then I'll ask whoever's telling me the story, what happened next, and what happened next, and what happened next. And if it builds in my head and I feel this will matter to other people, then I'll go for it. And then screw everything else.
Okay, well, thank you. There was also a question in the chat. Somebody asked about what the rules and advice would be on identifying particular military units and soldiers from particular places. And Patricia, do you have a thought on these? Obviously Ukrainian soldiers. Yeah.
No. The drug war was an odd time for us, because while a lot of people were reporting on the killings, and a lot of the killers were cops, there was, for a lot of us on the night shift, there was no sense of patriotism, because the president of the republic was the one saying, kill your own people. So we would name cops and we would name units, and for as long as it was factual, we would do it. But it's a completely
I think the
different
question
situation
is, just to come in quickly though, I
Ukraine.
think the question is the other way around here. So it's
Yes,
like,
exactly. So
yeah,
it's not something that is at all applicable.
In Northern Ireland, we wouldn't have given the names of police. In fact, we were banned from showing pictures of police and prison officers because their lives would have been in danger. So we wouldn't have given the names, and we would have been, one time I actually said a particular regiment had returned to Northern Ireland, and the government have a very strict notice. It's called a D notice. And I got a call saying I was breaking the D notice, which I hadn't realized because, you know, the troubles were over. So yeah, we wouldn't name individual soldiers except when they have passed. I mean, obviously, if someone's dead, then you would give their name, but we wouldn't give anything else, or name, because of our libel laws here are very strict. You know, you, even if you know who might have killed somebody, we can't do that here.
Yeah. So I guess the thing is this idea of like doing, you know, not making things worse and not causing unnecessary harm. And also, it sounds to me very much like a topic that the Ukrainian journalists together, obviously, I'm sure people have written about these issues for Ukrainian journalists, about the importance of not identifying soldiers in a way that would put their lives in harm, etc. But maybe there's some guidance or some sharing of information that would help and be useful to kind of identify what the specific issues are for Ukraine as well. Let's quickly, there's one last question from Zaporizhia, which this is from Artem, which is kind of interesting. He's written it in English, so I can read it. And that's a question of, what do we do when we're approaching people straight after something is happening, when they're very, you know, all the adrenaline is there and they're still in the moment straight after something has happened? So who wants to take that? I have some ideas.
I think what John said earlier is really important about giving them agency. So I think, first of all, saying you're a journalist and that you may have X time to speak to them. And first of all, are they safe? Do they feel safe to talk to you? I think that's the important thing. And you recognize they have been through, you know, a bombing, a shooting, or whatever that might be. But would they have time to talk to you? Could you go somewhere safe for a few minutes till you can share what has happened? I think that's kind of the opening. And then, I mean, John, I think John's advice on the kind of questions was really useful. Maybe John, you want to pick up? I mean, do you think that makes sense? Just, I think first of all, they have to feel safe where they are, safe with you.
You know, I think the two of you would probably be in many ways better at this. I mean, I've covered a lot of spoken to people in the immediacy after, you know, someone was killed. I was a crime reporter in the state of Florida, and I don't know if the state of Florida means anything to people in Ukraine, but it's sort of a famously chaotic place. And that was early in my career. So I was often knocking on a lot of doors right after someone's child had been killed, or often they had been accused of something. And I would the only advice I would give is that, you know, the first thing that I tell people who's in that situation is that I am sorry for what they're going through, that I tell them right away, I am sorry for what it is that you're experiencing, because, you know, we have to be human first, right? We have to be human first and journalists second. And, you know, I always say that, and I always mean it. And the day that I've always told myself, the day that I don't mean it, the day that I'm just saying that to say it, is the day that I need to go do something else with my career. But I think, you know, the rest of Angelina's advice was exactly right. You know, giving them agency, telling them what you're there to do, and do they want to talk? Do they feel comfortable? It's okay if they don't, right? So that's the only thought I have. If we had time, I do have a thought on the very good question about how you relax, but I'm very curious what Pat would say in answer to the first question.
You mean, oh, is my audio on?
Yeah.
You mean the answer to the question of how I relax?
I'm just curious how, you know, this idea of when you approach somebody in the heat of the moment, right? Like what your sort of process is after they've gone through some horrific thing, just moments later.
Right. For us, because we as was said earlier, we also have a tradition of wakes and funerals. It's a very long affair, and people talk to each other. For us, for me anyway, what I do after an interview or after a crime scene, if they still want to talk to me, we go out and smoke a cigarette and talk about something completely unnecessary. We talk about a rock star. We talk about a celebrity who broke up with someone else. I let them complain about their parents or their sons or their children. We just talk. And it's good for detail, but more, it's good to just feel human.
Yeah, absolutely. One thing I wanted to add to that is this idea of that when the story is really high pressured and things are happening and there's a lot of sense of danger and threat, is that we sometimes forget that we can slow ourselves down. And sometimes slowing everything down gives us more time, in the sense of it sort of makes things happen and possible. So just spending 30 seconds to take a deep breath, have a little ritual and think, last time I had to do this, last time I knocked on somebody's door, what was helpful? What did I do then? Could be really helpful. And also when we talk to people, there's a thing about slowing our voices down as well.
Mm-hmm.
So if we model calm, that can encourage people to be calm as well. So there's all sorts of little tricks and things that we can do. That's 90 minutes and a bit. So I think we've come to the end. And also the important thing about, we talked about some very heavy topics. And one of the things that we always advocate at the Dart-Center is the importance of remembering to look after ourselves. Because if we don't do that, then we're not going to be effective storytellers. So it's really important that we're kind of nice to ourselves and that we're compassionate and that we do things that keep us in a good place. The point about our compassion for ourselves is it makes it more likely that we'll be compassionate about the people we're writing about. So these things are kind of connected in a very kind of intimate way. And so what we're going to do at the end, after the session, is we're going to share slides, information. We can share the recording eventually. We can do that. But it's important that you have some downtime. Maybe do something after this that feels like something good. So I thank you. Oh, one last thing I want to do very quickly, actually. I'm giving you some homework, which is bad because I just said that you have to relax, but I'd like to just very quickly share that resources again so you know where to find us. That won't take long. Hang on a second. Sorry about this. Right, go back to this very quickly. So as I said, that we'll send this link out afterwards, and this goes into more detail. It's all in Ukrainian. And one last thing that maybe some of you can help us with is that this is a scientific survey that we're doing into resilience. And I know that you have to fill in lots of surveys and people send you surveys and surveys are kind of boring. And this is a very technical survey. So the questions are quite kind of technical, but it's really important because what this survey does, it's proper science, it's clinical psychology science, is it tries to understand burnout better. So I know a lot of you are feeling overloaded at times, but this survey may give us a bit more information about what helps deal with burnout. So it's a useful tool for newsrooms. But I'm saying it's a little bit technical, so it takes about 15 minutes to fill in. And if you're able to answer that and you can help us with that research, that would be great. So we'll send that out to you afterwards. Right, let me stop share. Good. So I don't know if anybody from the union has last words, but I just very quickly like to say that your work really matters to us. And it's a great privilege for us to have the opportunity to meet you, and we are, all of us in different ways and best as we can are following developments in Ukraine, and very much like to keep in touch with you and your work there.
А зі свого боку, від імені Національної спілки журналістів України, я хочу подякувати Гевіну, а також спікерам сьогоднішнього нашого вебінару Анджеліні, Джону і Патриції за те, що вони поділилися власним досвідом на власних прикладах, дали нам зрозуміти, яким важким часто буває рішення, як висвітлювати тему смерті, і як говорити із тими, хто пережив загибель своїх рідних. Але ці рішення, про які сьогодні ми дізналися, вони справді від реальної практики журналістики. І дуже цінно для українських журналістів мати ці приклади і мати ці настанови. Я ще раз дякую Гевіну Різу і всій команді Дарт-центру за те, що стартували із серією із 3 вебінарів. Будь ласка, стежте за нашими анонсами, ви будете отримувати запрошення на реєстрацію на наступні наші заходи. І дякую за те, що ви були з нами. Залишайтеся в безпеці і знайте, що завжди можете отримати допомогу і пораду від Національної спілки журналістів України та її партнерів. Дякую вам.
Great, thank you so much. And the next episode is about working with children, and you'll hear from some real experts with a lot of experience of interviewing children, and go into a bit more detail about how to do that. Good.